They said I wouldn't last a month. It was spoken quietly, over the rim of a crystal wine glass, by a woman who had spent the last 40 years curating a life built on the silence of others. Eleanor Vance did not look at me when she said it. She looked at her husband, Robert, as if sharing a private joke about the weather, but the air in the dining room shifted instantly, heavy and cold, settling over the table like a shroud. I was sitting at the right hand of her son, Marcus, the man I was supposed to marry in 6 weeks. I heard it. I heard the slight clink of her fork against the porcelain plate, the soft exhale of amusement, and the words themselves, precise and lethal. She won't last a month. They were talking about me, Leilani, 41 years old, a woman who had built a career in forensic accounting from the ground up, a woman who balanced ledgers for a living and knew the weight of every decimal point. But in their world, in the manicured lawns of Greenwich, Connecticut, where the Vance family held court, I was not a professional. I was not a partner. I was an acquisition, and like any asset they deemed risky, I was expected to depreciate quickly. They believed I was a gold digger who had stumbled into a dynasty too complex for my mind to navigate. They believed I was soft. They believed I was desperate. And because they believed those things, they made the mistake of assuming I was blind. I did not react to Eleanor's comment. I did not flush with anger or stumble over my napkin. I simply cut my steak, the knife sliding through the tender meat with silent efficiency, and I took a sip of water. I let the words hang in the air, unacknowledged, because I knew something they did not. I knew that in my profession, silence is not submission. Silence is data collection. It is the space between the tick and the talk where the truth reveals itself if you are patient enough to listen. I looked at Marcus, who was laughing at something his father said, oblivious to the venom his mother had just sprayed across the mahogany table. He looked handsome in the dim light, polished and charming, the kind of man who opens doors and remembers anniversaries, or at least pretends to. But I had seen the numbers. I had seen the trails of money that vanished into offshore accounts and the loans that were secured against assets that no longer existed. The Vance family empire was not a fortress. It was a facade peeling paint over rotting wood, and they needed me not for my love, but for my liquidity. They thought they were hunting me. They did not realize that I had already checked the trap, identified the trigger, and was simply waiting for the right moment to spring it back on them. The dinner continued, filled with polite conversation about flower arrangements and seating charts, but beneath the surface, the war had already begun. I finished my meal, wiped my mouth, and smiled at Eleanor. I told her the wine was excellent. I told her I was looking forward to the wedding. I lied with a perfection that would have made her proud had she known I was practicing for the final act. The engagement had been a whirlwind, or so it appeared to the outside eye. Marcus and I had met at a charity gala 8 months prior, an event where I was working as a consultant to audit the donations, and he was a major donor. He was attentive, persistent, and seemingly smitten. He pursued me with the intensity of a man who had found something rare. I was cautious, naturally. At 41, I had been married before, briefly, to a man who loved the idea of me more than the reality. That marriage had ended in a quiet divorce and a lesson learned. Emotions are volatile, but contracts are permanent. When Marcus proposed, he did it in front of his family, at this same dining table. It was a performance. Eleanor had tears in her eyes, Robert raised a toast, and Marcus slipped a diamond ring onto my finger that was too large, too flashy, and exactly the kind of thing a woman like me would never choose for herself. It was a signal. It was them telling me what my role would be. I was to be the ornament, the trophy wife who would sit quietly at events and validate their status. I accepted the ring. I accepted the proposal. And I accepted the prenuptial agreement they slid across the table 3 days later. The prenup was thick, bound in leather, drafted by a firm that charged by the minute to ensure every loophole was sealed tight. It was designed to protect the Vance family wealth from me. It stipulated that in the event of a divorce, I would receive nothing unless the marriage lasted 5 years. Even then, the payout was modest, a stipend rather than a share. It was insulting, legally aggressive, and exactly what I expected. They wanted to ensure that if I tried to leave, or if they decided to discard me, I would walk away with nothing but the clothes on my back. They wanted to keep me on a leash. Most women would have been offended. Most women would have argued or cried or threatened to call off the wedding. I did none of those things. I took the document home. I read every clause. I highlighted every section. And then I gave it to my own attorney, a sharp woman named Sarah who specialized in high net worth dissolutions. Sarah read the document and laughed. She told me it was aggressive, but it was built on a foundation of specific financial disclosures that Marcus had provided. She told me that if those disclosures were false, the entire agreement could be voided for fraud. That was the key. The prenup was only as strong as the honesty of the man signing it. And Marcus Vance was not an honest man. I had suspected this for weeks. I had noticed the way he checked his phone during dinner, the way he flinched when certain numbers were mentioned, the way he avoided talking about the specifics of his business ventures. He spoke in vagaries about investments and holdings, but when I asked for details, he deflected with charm. He told me I worried too much. He told me to leave the business to the men. It was patronizing, but it was also a shield. He was hiding something, so I started digging. I did not hack his emails. I did not snoop through his physical mail. I used public records. I used my access to financial databases. I looked at the property records, the corporate filings, the lien reports. What I found was a house of cards. The Vance Family Trust, which was supposed to be the bedrock of their wealth, was leveraged to the hilt. Robert Vance had been using the trust assets to secure personal loans to cover gambling debts and bad investments. Marcus was not the heir apparent, he was the bailout. They needed my money. I had a substantial portfolio, built from years of careful saving and intelligent investing. I owned my home outright. I had no debt. To them, I was a life raft. They planned to marry me, merge our finances just enough to access my liquidity through joint accounts or loans secured against my assets, and then discard me once the cash was absorbed. The prenup was there to ensure I couldn't claim a share of their remaining wealth when they dumped me. It was a perfect plan, cold and calculated, but they had underestimated me. They thought because I was quiet, I was weak. They thought because I didn't scream, I didn't know. I knew everything. I knew the exact amount of their debt. I knew the names of the creditors. I knew the timeline of their insolvency. And I knew that if I played this right, I wouldn't just walk away. I would leave them in ruins. The weeks leading up to the wedding were an exercise in psychological endurance. Eleanor took charge of the planning, which was her way of asserting control. She chose the venue, a historic estate in upstate New York that belonged to a distant cousin. She chose the flowers, the music, the menu. She treated me like a child who was allowed to pick the color of the napkins, but not the fabric. Every meeting was a subtle interrogation. She would ask about my work, tilting her head as if trying to understand why a woman would need a career when she had a husband to provide. She would ask about my friends, implying that my past life was something to be shed like old skin. She wanted to isolate me. She wanted to ensure that when the marriage ended, I would have no support system to catch me. I played the part. I smiled, I nodded. I let her choose the napkins. I let her choose the flowers. I gave her the illusion of power because power makes people careless. When you think you are winning, you stop checking your blind spots. I used this time to prepare. I met with Sarah, my lawyer, in secret. We drafted a contingency plan. We prepared the paperwork for an annulment based on fraud, ready to be filed the moment I had the final proof. We set up a separate bank account, one that Marcus did not know about, and I began moving my liquid assets into it. I did not drain everything, not yet. That would trigger alarms. I moved just enough to secure my immediate future. I kept the appearances intact. I attended the fittings. I tasted the cakes. I listened to Eleanor's stories about Marcus's childhood, stories that now sounded like warnings. She spoke of his temper, masked as passion. She spoke of his entitlement, masked as confidence. She was proud of these things. She thought they made him strong. I knew they made him vulnerable. Arrogance is a crack in the armor, and I was the water that would seep in and freeze until the metal shattered. The only thing I did not concede on was the honeymoon. Initially, they had planned it. Eleanor had booked a private island in the Caribbean, owned by a friend of the family. It was secluded. It was controlled. It was a place where I would be cut off from the world, dependent on their transport, their staff, their rules. It was a golden cage. When the itinerary arrived on my desk, I looked at it for a long time. I saw the trap. If I went there, I would be isolated. If I needed to file papers, if I needed to meet with counsel, if I needed to execute the final phase of my plan, I would be stuck. I needed to be somewhere else. I needed to be somewhere with jurisdiction, with access, with autonomy. I told Marcus I wanted to change the plans. I told him I had always dreamed of going to Chicago. I told him I wanted to see the architecture, the museums, the city. It was a strange request for a honeymoon, away from the beaches and the sun, but I framed it as a desire for culture, for something meaningful. Marcus hesitated. He looked at his mother. Eleanor frowned. They didn't understand. Why would I choose a city over a private island? Why would I choose noise over silence? They suspected, but they couldn't prove anything. I was still the compliant bride. I was still wearing the ring. I was still signing the checks for the things they asked me to pay for. I insisted on Chicago. I used a tactic I had learned in negotiations, the reasonable compromise. I told them I would let them keep the venue and the guest list if I could have the honeymoon. It seemed like a fair trade to them. They got the public spectacle, I got the private trip. They agreed. They thought it didn't matter. They thought wherever I went, I would still be theirs. They were wrong. Chicago was not about the architecture. It was about the law. It was about the distance from Connecticut. It was about being in a city where I had contacts, where I could move unseen. And it was about the timing. I changed the dates slightly. I shortened the trip by 2 days. I told Marcus I had a project waiting for me, that I couldn't be away for too long. He laughed. He told me to quit my job. He told me I wouldn't need to work anymore. I smiled and told him we would discuss it after the honeymoon. I needed those 2 days. I needed the buffer. I needed the space to breathe before the final collapse. The wedding day arrived with a sky the color of bruised steel. It was fitting. The ceremony was held in a garden that smelled of lilies and damp earth. There were 300 guests, all of them people who mattered in the world the Vances inhabited. Senators, CEOs, judges. It was a display of power, a declaration that the Vance family was still at the top of the food chain. I walked down the aisle on the arm of my father, who had flown in from Ohio. He looked proud. He didn't know the truth. I hadn't told him. I didn't want him to worry. I wanted him to see me happy, even if the happiness was a construct. I wore a dress of simple silk, no lace, no trains. I wanted to be able to move. I wanted to be ready. Marcus waited at the altar. He looked nervous. He should have been. He was marrying a woman who knew his secrets. When we exchanged vows, I looked him in the eye. I spoke the words clearly. I promised to honor and cherish. I did not promise to obey. I made sure of that. I had the officiant remove that word during the review of the script. Eleanor noticed. She narrowed her eyes, but it was too late to change it. The die was cast. We signed the license. We took the photos. We danced the first dance. Throughout it all, I felt a cold calmness settling over me. This was not a celebration. This was a closing ceremony. I was burying the version of myself that would have been a victim. I was stepping into the version of myself that would be a survivor. During the reception, I kept my phone in my clutch. I checked it periodically, under the table, beneath the napkin. I was waiting for a message. Sarah was working. While I was cutting the cake, while I was smiling for the cameras, she was finalizing the packet. She was compiling the evidence. She was preparing the filing. The evidence was substantial. I had found proof that Marcus had transferred funds from his personal accounts into a shell company 2 weeks before we met. It was money that belonged to the family trust. He was stealing from his own parents to cover his losses. He was using the marriage to legitimize his financial position, to make himself look stable to the banks. If the marriage went through without issue, he could use my credit to refinance his debts. But if the marriage was annulled based on fraud, the financial mergers would be reversed, and the theft would be exposed. I had to time it perfectly. If I did it too soon, before the wedding, they could cancel and cut their losses. If I did it too late, after the finances were fully merged, it would be a messy divorce. I needed the annulment. I needed the marriage to be declared void from the start. That meant I had to act before the marriage was fully consummated in the eyes of the law regarding financial commingling. The honeymoon was the buffer. It was the period where we were legally married but financially separate, a grace period I had engineered by delaying the signing of the joint account paperwork. I had told Marcus I needed to check with my financial advisor before merging assets. He had agreed, impatiently, assuming I would sign once we were back from the trip. He was wrong. I would never sign. We left for the honeymoon the morning after the wedding. The send-off was elaborate. Confetti, cheers, the waving of hands. Elinor hugged me tightly. She whispered in my ear that she hoped I would be very happy. It was a threat disguised as a wish. She hoped I would be happy enough to stay quiet. She hoped I would be happy enough to ignore the signs. We drove to the airport in a limousine. Marcus drank champagne. He was relieved. He thought he had won. He thought he had secured the asset. He talked about the future, about the house we would buy, about the children we would have. I listened. I nodded. I let him paint the picture. It made the destruction of it more satisfying. When we landed in Chicago, the air was cooler, sharper. We checked into a hotel in the Loop. It was a nice hotel, but it was not a resort. There were people everywhere. There was noise. There was life. Marcus wanted to go to the bar. I told him I was tired. I told him I wanted to rest. He shrugged and went down alone. He wanted to celebrate. He wanted to drink to his victory. I stayed in the room. I locked the door. I took my laptop out of my bag. I connected to the secure network. I called Sarah. She was waiting. I gave her the go-ahead. It was the simplest command I had ever given. Execute. Within minutes, the process began. The papers were filed electronically with the court in Connecticut. The notice of fraud was sent to the Vance Family Trust administrators. The evidence package was emailed to Robert and Elinor Vance. I did not call them. I did not text them. I let the documents speak for me. The documents were cold, hard, and undeniable. They showed the transfers. They showed the dates. They showed the signatures. They showed that Marcus had lied on the financial disclosure forms required for the prenup. They showed that he had lied to me, and under the law, that lie invalidated the contract. It invalidated the marriage. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the lights of the city blink on against the darkening sky. I felt nothing. No guilt, no sadness, no anger. There was only clarity. I had protected myself. I had protected my future. I had ensured that I would not be the woman who lost everything because she was too polite to fight. I heard Marcus come back into the room. He was humming. He smelled of whiskey and cigars. He kicked off his shoes and flopped onto the bed. He asked me if I wanted to order room service. I told him no. I told him we needed to talk. He laughed. He said there was nothing to talk about. We were married. We were on our honeymoon. He reached for me. I moved away. I stood up. I walked to the desk. I picked up my phone. I showed him the screen. It was a notification from his bank. His accounts were frozen. The trust had initiated an emergency freeze based on the evidence of embezzlement. He looked at the phone. He looked at me. The color drained from his face. The arrogance vanished. In its place was fear, raw, primal fear. He asked me what I had done. I told him the truth. I told him I had changed the honeymoon plans because I needed to be somewhere I could work. I told him I had spent the last 2 months auditing his life. I told him I knew about the debt. I told him I knew about the theft. I told him the marriage was over. He started to shout. He stood up, knocking the lamp off the table. He told me I couldn't do this. He told me I was his wife. He told me I was nothing without him. I looked at him, and I saw him clearly for the first time. He was not a predator. He was a child playing with fire, and now he was burned. I told him he was right. I was nothing without him, but he was everything without me, and now he had nothing. I walked to the door. I picked up my bag. I had packed it while he was at the bar. I was ready. I told him the lawyers would be in touch. I told him not to contact me. I told him not to try to find me. I opened the door. He screamed my name. He begged. He offered me money. He offered me the house. He offered me anything. I didn't turn around. I walked out into the hallway. The carpet was thick and quiet under my feet. I took the elevator down. I walked out into the lobby. The city was alive. People were rushing to dinners, to shows, to lives that were their own. I hailed a cab. I gave the driver the address of a different hotel, one where Marcus would not think to look. I needed one night to myself. I needed to sleep without the sound of his breathing. I needed to wake up knowing it was done. The next morning, I flew back to Connecticut, not to the Vance estate, to my own home, the house I owned, the house that was in my name only. When I arrived, the driveway was empty. There were no cars from the family. There were no letters slid under the door. There was only silence. I went inside. I poured a glass of wine. I sat in my living room and I waited. I knew the fallout would be swift. The Vance family did not tolerate scandal. They did not tolerate weakness. Marcus had stolen from them, he had embarrassed them, and he had failed to secure the money they needed. They would not protect him. They would cut him off to save themselves. I turned on the news. There was nothing. It was too quiet for the news. But in their world, the news traveled through phone calls and closed-door meetings. By noon, my phone rang. It was Alina. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message. Her voice was shaking. She demanded to know what I had done. She called me a viper. She called me a thief. She said I had ruined her son. I listened to the message twice. Then I deleted it. I did not owe her an explanation. I did not owe her anything. Later that afternoon, Sarah called. She told me the trust had filed a lawsuit against Marcus. They were seeking full restitution. They were freezing all his assets. The prenup was void. The marriage was being annulled. I was free. I was clear. I was safe. She told me that Marcus was staying at a hotel, paid for by a credit card that had just been declined. He was stranded. He was alone. The people who had laughed at me at the dinner table were now turning on each other. Robert was blaming Alina for not vetting me better. Alina was blaming Robert for the gambling debts that started the rot. Marcus was blaming everyone but himself. The hierarchy had collapsed. The order they had tried to impose on me had shattered. I spent the rest of the week working. I went to my office. I answered my emails. I balanced my ledgers. I lived my life. I did not hide. I did not change my number. I wanted them to know I was accessible but untouchable. I wanted them to know that I was not afraid of them. A few days later, I received a letter from Marcus's lawyer. It was a settlement offer. They wanted me to drop the annulment. They wanted me to agree to a divorce instead. They were willing to give me money. A significant amount, enough to buy a new house, enough to never work again. It was a bribe. They wanted to keep the annulment off the record. They wanted to hide the fraud. They wanted to protect the family name. I read the offer. I calculated the value. It was fair. It was more than I would have gotten in a divorce. It was reparations. I called Sarah. I told her to accept, but with conditions. The conditions were strict. The payment had to be upfront. The confidentiality agreement had to exclude me from any liability regarding the fraud investigation. I would not be silenced about the truth if asked under oath. I would not be a co-conspirator in their cover-up. They agreed. They had no choice. They needed me to sign. They needed the marriage to end quietly so they could focus on saving what was left of the empire. I signed the papers. I took the money. I deposited it into my account. I looked at the balance. It was a number that represented security. It represented freedom. It represented the cost of their arrogance. I did not spend it. I invested it. I let it grow. I let it work for me. The ending was not dramatic. There was no courtroom showdown. There was no public scandal in the papers. The Vances were too powerful for that. They swept it under the rug. They issued a statement saying that Marcus and I had mutually agreed to part ways due to incompatibility. They lied. But I didn't care. The truth was in the bank accounts. The truth was in the legal filings that were sealed but existed. The truth was in the fact that I was still standing and they were limping. Marcus disappeared from the social circuit. I heard he moved to Florida. I heard he was working in sales. I heard he was drinking. I did not verify these things. I did not need to. His fate was no longer my concern. My concern was my own life. I had reclaimed my time. I had reclaimed my energy. I had reclaimed my name. I was no longer the woman who wouldn't last a month. I was the woman who had lasted long enough to burn the house down. I thought about Alina often. I wondered if she sat at that dining table and looked at the empty seat where I used to sit. I wondered if she remembered the comment she had made. I wondered if she understood that she had created her own destruction. She had tried to break me, and in doing so, she had sharpened me. She had given me the motivation to be thorough. She had given me the reason to be ruthless. I owed her nothing, not even gratitude. I moved on. I started dating again, slowly. I met a man who worked in education. He had no money. He had no power. He had kindness. He did not know about the Vances. He did not care about my portfolio. He cared about me. We went to dinner. We walked in the park. We talked about books. It was simple. It was real. It was mine. One evening, almost a year after the wedding that wasn't, I was at a restaurant in the city. I saw a woman who looked like Alina. She was sitting at a table with a group of people, holding court, speaking loudly. I watched her for a moment. She looked tired. The power was slipping. The money was tighter. The empire was shrinking. I felt a pang of something, not pity. Not satisfaction, just observation. I turned back to my date. I listened to what he was saying. I smiled. I took a bite of my food. The past was a ledger that had been balanced. The books were closed. I was no longer an accountant for other people's mistakes. I was the owner of my own life. There is a specific kind of peace that comes from knowing you handled it. It is not the peace of forgiveness. It is not the peace of moving on without looking back. It is the peace of knowing that when the wolf came to the door, you did not hide. You did not pray. You checked the lock. You loaded the gun. You waited. And when the time came, you fired. I often think about the honeymoon plans. Changing them was the first real act of rebellion. It was the signal that I was not going where they told me to go. It was the signal that I had my own map. People often ask me, in subtle ways, how I survived it. They ask how I didn't break. They assume I must have been devastated. They assume I must have loved him. I tell them I loved the idea of stability. I tell them I loved the possibility of partnership. But I loved myself more. And that is the secret. That is the thing they don't teach you in the stories. They tell you love conquers all. They tell you kindness is its own reward. But sometimes, justice is the only reward that matters. Sometimes, you have to be the villain in someone else's story to be the hero in your own. I do not regret what I did. I do not wish I had been softer. I do not wish I had given them a chance. They showed me who they were in the first month. I believed them, and I acted accordingly. The world is full of people who will tell you that you won't last. They will tell you that you are too old, too poor, too weak, too much. They will bet against you. They will whisper at dinner tables. Let them. Let them place their bets. Let them make their plans. You just need to know one thing. You need to know where the exit is. You need to know where the leverage is. You need to know that when the time comes, you can change the plans. You can change the destination. You can change the outcome. I changed the honeymoon plans. And in doing so, I changed my life. I did not go to the island. I did not sit in the cage. I went to the city. I went to the work. I went to the truth, and I came out the other side with everything intact. My money, my mind, my soul. They said I wouldn't last a month. They were right. The version of me that would have tolerated them didn't last a month. She died in that hotel room in Chicago. And the woman who walked out was new. She was colder. She was sharper. She was mine. I still work in forensic accounting. I still balance ledgers. But now I work for myself. I choose my clients. I choose my cases. I look for the discrepancies. I look for the lies. I help other women find the truth in their own lives. I help them see the numbers. I help them understand that the contract is only as good as the honesty behind it. I tell them to watch the hands that sign the papers. I tell them to listen to the whispers at the dinner table. I tell them that if someone says you won't last, you should take it as a challenge. Not to prove them wrong by staying, but to prove them wrong by leaving on your own terms. There is power in the exit. There is power in the closure. There is power in the silence after the storm. I have that silence now. It is not empty. It is full. It is full of the things I chose. It is full of the things I built. It is full of the things I kept. The Vances are a memory. Marcus is a lesson. Eleanor is a warning. And I am the result. I am the evidence that you can walk through the fire and not burn if you are careful enough, if you are cold enough, if you are ready. I look in the mirror sometimes. I see the lines around my eyes. I see the gray in my hair. I see the age. I am 42 now. I am older. I am wiser. I am not afraid. I remember the girl who sat at that table and cut her steak. I remember the woman who walked out of the hotel room. They are the same person. They are me. And I am still here. I am still lasting. And I will last as long as I choose. The story is over. The ledger is balanced. The account is closed. But my life continues. And it is mine. Every day, every dollar. Every breath, I took it back. And I am never giving it away again. There are moments, late at night, when the house is quiet and the city sounds fade into the background, that I think about the specific mechanics of that week. The way the email server hummed when I hit send. The way the light hit the glass of the hotel window. The way Marcus's voice cracked when he realized the cards were gone. These details are etched into my mind, not as trauma, but as milestones. They mark the transition from who I was to who I am. It is important to remember the details. It is important to remember the precision. Revenge is not a blur of emotion. It is a sequence of events. It is a checklist. Step 1. Identify the threat. Step 2. Gather the evidence. Step 3. Secure the assets. Step 4. Execute the plan. Step 5. Walk away. I followed the steps. I did not deviate. I did not improvisate. I stuck to the protocol. That is why it worked. If I had acted out of anger, I would have made a mistake. I would have screamed. I would have threatened. I would have given them the chance to prepare. By staying calm, by staying silent, I kept the element of surprise. And in law, as in war, surprise is the greatest weapon. I used it. I wielded it like a scalpel. I cut out the tumor before it could spread. And now I am healthy. Now I am whole. I think about the other women who sit at those tables. The women who hear the whispers. The women who feel the coldness. I want to tell them to listen. I want to tell them to watch. I want to tell them that they don't have to accept the seat they are given. They can pull up their own chair. They can build their own table. They can change the plans. It is not easy. It requires sacrifice. I sacrifice the idea of a fairy tale. I sacrifice the comfort of denial. I chose the hard truth over the soft lie, and it was worth it. Every second of it. I would do it again. I would sit at that table. I would hear that comment. I would smile. And I would plan, because I know now that I am capable. I know now that I am strong. I know now that I am enough. Not because a man said so. Not because a family accepted me, but because I said so, because I accepted myself. That is the real victory. The money is nice. The security is nice. But the self-respect is everything. Without that, you are nothing. With it, you are unstoppable. I have it. I keep it. I guard it. And anyone who tries to take it will find out exactly what I am capable of. They said I wouldn't last a month. They were wrong. I lasted forever, and I will continue to last. As long as I have my mind, as long as I have my will, as long as I have the truth. The truth is the only thing that matters in the end. The rest is just noise. The rest is just wind. I have learned to tune it out. I have learned to focus on the signal. And the signal is clear. I am here, I am safe, I am free, and I am never going back. The seasons change. The leaves turn. The snow falls. Life moves on. I have marked the anniversary of the wedding. Not with sadness, not with celebration, just with acknowledgement. It was a day that changed the trajectory of my life. It was a day I chose myself. I usually spend it working. I usually spend it doing something productive. I do not dwell, I do not reminisce, I look forward. I have plans for the future. I have goals, I have dreams that are mine alone. I am building a legacy. Not for a husband, not for a family, for me, for the women who come after me. I want them to know that it is possible. I want them to know that they don't have to be victims. I want them to know that they can fight, and they can win. It is not about being mean. It is about being smart. It is not about being cruel. It is about being just. There is a difference. I was not cruel, I gave them exactly what they earned. I gave Marcus the consequences of his actions. I gave Alina the result of her arrogance. I gave myself the protection I deserved. That is justice. That is balance. That is the way the world should work. It doesn't always. But sometimes, if you are willing to do the work, it does. I did the work. I put in the hours. I read the documents. I made the calls. I took the risk. And I got the reward. It is a simple equation. Input equals output. Effort equals result. I invested in myself. And the return on investment has been infinite. I look at my life now. It is quiet. It is stable. It is good. I have friends who know the truth. I have colleagues who respect me. I have a home that is safe. I have a future that is bright. I do not need anyone to save me. I saved myself. And that is the best feeling in the world. To know that you are the architect of your own survival, to know that you held the pen, to know that you wrote the ending. They tried to write it for me. They tried to cast me as the footnote, the wife who didn't last, the woman who failed, but I rewrote the script. I made myself the protagonist. I made myself the hero. And I closed the book on my terms. That is all that matters. The rest is just noise. The rest is just history. And I am done with history. I am living in the present. I am building the future. And I am doing it my way. No apologies, no explanations, no regrets, just results. That is the only language they understand. That is the only language that matters. Speak in results, act in truth, live in power. That is my code, that is my life, and it is enough. It has to be, because it is all I have, and it is all I need. I am Leilani, I am 41, I am free, and I am just getting started. The honeymoon is over, the work has begun, and I am ready for whatever comes next. Let them bet against me. Let them whisper. Let them plan. I will be here. I will be ready, and I will win, again and again, until the end. That is my promise to myself, and to anyone who is listening. You can last, you can win, you can change the plans, you just have to want it enough. And you have to be willing to do what it takes. I was, and I did, and so can you. The choice is yours, the power is yours, the life is yours, take it.